t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello there and welcome to Brussels, My Love, Euronews' weekly politics programme with me, Maeve McMahon. Thank you so much for tuning in. Coming up, after months of speculation, the US finally voted on who should preside over the superpower for the next 4 years. The campaign was poisonous and super tight, but in the end, it was Donald J. Trump who was chosen. We take a closer look at EU reactions on a week the German coalition government collapsed. And the incoming US president will have to fix America first, and the EU will have to learn to stand alone. We take a look at how the European economy could be shaken during a second Trump presidency whilst juggling ongoing wars, natural disasters and multiple shocks. A warm welcome to our panel this weekend. Matthew Robinson, the director of the Eurogulf Information Centre. Good to have you with us. Natalie McNeilis, trade lawyer covering mergers and acquisitions for MLEX. Welcome. And Greg Svingen, senior advisor at Rudd Pedersen's Public Affairs and also spokesperson for Democrats Abroad. So great to have you all with us.
Thank you.
Before we bring in your views, let's just hear what exactly happened in the US. Euronews' US politics analyst Boyd Wagner explains.
On Tuesday, about 150 million Americans voted in the pivotal election for the next US president. Heading into the election, we are tracking a whole bunch of key topics, demographics, and specifically 7 key swing states and how they might impact the final outcome. Among that, we were wondering, is there going to be a historic gender gap in this that's going to create a blue wall that would benefit the Kamala Harris campaign? Turns out that didn't happen. Instead, what we saw was a red wave. And within that red wave, there were a whole host of key demographics that came out in support of Donald Trump that you usually see come out in support of a Democratic candidate for president. Minorities, young people, all of these played into the pivotal win by Donald Trump. So now that begs the question, what does that mean for the rest of the world and what does that mean for Europe?
So that was Boyd Wagner with his take on what happened. Of course, Donald Trump now will be the next president of the US after securing more than enough states, including the so-called blue wall in Pennsylvania, Michigan and Wisconsin for the second time. Now, Greg, I see you've brought your map along. You've probably been glued to it all week, but Americans have clearly spoken and they've chosen Donald Trump again over a woman. Did you see this coming?
I think that probably, if you talk to most people about this, they would say that they're surprised, but also anticipated at the same time. It's a very, very strange political moment because what we've seen, it's an undeniable, spectacular comeback. I mean, the word phoenix was used yesterday. That's a little bit too positive, a little bit too charitable to the figure we're talking about. But I still was optimistic. Iowa, that poll gave us some last-minute hope. I think we've learned over the last few elections to not believe very much in polls. And I personally had not been looking at polls for about the last week. I just said, don't look at polls. Yeah, there's an element of shock and surprise, but also a little bit of having been ready for it, having seen surprises previous to that.
And what has the reaction been here, Natalie, in Brussels?
I really think that the thought, I am with you on that. I think what I see is a kind of a resignation. What I really see is that, especially from what we're hearing from the European corridors, is that there's not the shock that we had in 2016. It's more a feeling of we were hoping for a different outcome, we're disappointed about this outcome, but we saw it coming and we've been preparing for it. And I think, something you said in the beginning, this is going to be an America First era. To be quite honest with you, that's also what I'm seeing from the EU's side, is a much more, we're prepared to act for Europe first. And I think that's been the initial reaction that we've seen to the Trump victory is, yeah, we're also going to be putting Europe first. So it's going to be fair enough. Here we go.
Things are going to get very interesting indeed. We've heard a lot of calls this week on X for people saying this is the wake-up call for Europe, even though 2016 was a wake-up call, but now it seems like they might be getting serious. Of course, EU leaders were in Budapest this week, signing off on the Budapest Declaration, gathering as well for this European political community, discussing their response. And as we said as well, ambassadors were meeting the other night as well to see how this could play. But Matthew, Republicans have also taken a majority in the Senate. So Donald Trump will be able to put in place anyone he likes, really.
Yeah, and to quote the legendary Democratic strategist, it's the economy, stupid. And I think this was the big flaw of the Harris campaign. They turned it into a referendum on the previous Trump presidency, on democracy. And what did the American voters said? Most exit polls suggest they didn't like the economic direction of the country and ultimately rejected the Biden-Harris administration. This will be the 47th president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, the political comebacks of all political comebacks. The first president, I think, since Grover Cleveland to lose a presidential election and come back, will be an imperial presidency. He has the Senate. Some indicators, though not 100% sure, look like he might hold on to the House as well. And he has 3 of his own in the U.S. Supreme Court. Chances are he might even get to make one more Supreme Court pick. It's probably one of the most conservative courts. He has all branches of government. This will be one of the most powerful presidencies of the United States in modern times.
And Elon Musk has said that his victory as well hails the start of his political ambitions, but just not only on the economy, because the American economy is doing much better than it was. Was it really the economy stupid, or was it also issues like immigration?
I mean, I do think immigration is an important topic, but I really think you're onto something with it's the economy stupid, because I think that people feel that they're in a worse place economically than they were 4 years ago. And they blame the current administration. Everyone says it's an old trope that the president doesn't have that much to do with the economy. And yet, who else are you going to look to? Where does the buck stop? And I think what we see here really is that we had an unpopular administration and Kamala running with that as her foundation.
Before we get on to the next thing, it's the economy stupid from 1992 needs a little bit of a refresh. Let's be honest. It's not the economy stupid, it's inflation. And that's where the campaign really had a hard time fighting against the cost of eggs, the cost of gas at the pump, and looking closely at where that came from. And that would have been something you could have unpacked and brought back to the pandemic, because people had this, sort of rose-tinted view of, things in 2016. But people were not trained back to, and this is due to Americans' very shallow sense of political history that we've seen in the results of this election. Yep. People were not trained back to go to the pandemic and then look at what happened and how it was managed. Just a question, how would the economy have fared if we hadn't taken 500,000 people out and effectively killed them over mismanagement of the pandemic? So it's the economy, but inflation too.
Oh, there are issues too. And of course, we wanted to hear what the feeling was like in DC this week. So we can take a listen now to Euronews' Stefan Grobe. He's been there all week covering the elections for us.
Well, the establishment in this town is shell-shocked. Nobody saw this coming. Not the pundits, not the experts, not the pollsters, except Donald Trump. And, presidential elections are always a character test, not only for the candidates, but also for the country. And veteran political analyst David Ignatius said this election made him realize how little he understood the character of Americans in 2024. Trump voters are only interested in one thing, and that is Trump can fix it. All the rest, all the drama, all the court cases, all the rhetoric, they don't care.
Stefan Grobe there with an update from DC. You were looking a bit shocked there.
I can't believe that he thought that the political establishment was shocked. If he would say shocked by the potential to have won the presidency by a healthy margin, which we see, and the Senate and the GOP, that's a shocker. But the actual result, I think that,
What's next for the Democrats, Matthew?
Well, I think for the Democratic Party, this was a car crash in slow motion. I think on reflection, they sealed their fate when Joe Biden initially decided to run for re-election. If the Democratic Party from the beginning of this year had an open and competitive primary process, by the way, a primary that the Vice President, Kamala Harris, probably would have lost or at least been put under a lot of pressure on, the party could have been in a completely different place. The American voters were taken for granted in part. They saw a change at the top of the ticket at the 11th hour. And yes, and all credit to the vice president. She ran an incredible campaign, record levels of fundraising, but it wasn't enough.
Well, it was $1 billion, wasn't it? And she still didn't win. Perhaps she was handed the reins too late in the game. But we can actually just take a look at what she said. She spoke to her supporters the day after. In her concession speech, she said, "The outcome of the elections is, of course, not what we wanted, not what we fought for, and not what we voted for. While I concede the election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign." And she also, I think, picked up the phone and she called Donald Trump and she congratulated him, calling for a peaceful transition. Will we see a peaceful transition?
We'll see a peaceful transition. The one line that stood out as a very deliberate placement in that speech was indeed precisely what you just highlighted, that peaceful transition. It's kind of in the Michelle Obama line of when they go low, we go high. And I think the Democratic Party there's a teachable moment here. We're seeing a hint of it, and we'll see it executed. I have zero doubts that there will be a peaceful transition.
What about you, Natalie?
No, I think that is one of the things that upset the system so much, was this, for the first time, a real effort to overturn the vote the last time around. And so I think that what we see now and what I hear from the Europeans is we're so grateful that this is the approach that Harris is taking, because it allows us to move on now. We know what is the mandate, and we can handle it. What they were really concerned about was a long period of limbo where it wasn't clear what the outcome was and how do they negotiate, there are things that have to happen in the interim. They can't wait until January to deal with bilateral problems between the EU and the US. And so I think that that is one thing that really is a comfort to the Europeans, that it's clear who is taking the reins.
And you're, of course, the spokesperson as well for Democrats abroad. Like, what kind of conversations were you having this week?
They were tough conversations. A lot of introspection. And I think what I was really concerned about, there were hints of it. I think it was yesterday, I heard it in French, trouver un fautif, looking for who to blame, the blame game. I don't have time for that. We made every single effort possible. The ground game, speaking of a different game to talk about, in Pennsylvania, she had 50,000 volunteers on the ground knocking on doors. This is retail politics at its best. It's not the glam of being at a rally, taking a selfie with one of the candidates behind you. This is pushing up sleeves, knocking on doors in neighborhoods that might be new to you, strange to you, and engaging with voters. The ground game was an excellent ground game. 50,000 volunteers. That's
you were
huge.
one of them.
I was one. It's tiring work. It's physically and emotionally tiring work. But I think the discussions do center around, did we do the right thing at the communication level? And that is a really tricky one. How did the communication
Well,
play
on
out?
communication
We'll talk about
level,
that.
I mean, if you look at Donald Trump's TikTok accounts, his slick videos, his Trump will fix it. That messaging really resonated with a lot of men, a lot of young men, Latino men, black men, who really felt part of the Donald Trump team here.
And this is where there's been a big shift. Big tech in the US historically had lined up at Silicon Valley, had lined up behind the Democratic Party. You've seen a shift in the last couple cycles where big tech giants like Elon Musk are rolling behind Donald Trump. I think that did have an impact. I mean, Musk led a somewhat controversial project of, I think it was donating $1 million a day to those that signed his petition in some swing states. There's been some legality questions about it, but it excited the electorate. I think that did have a impact on the margins. I mean, this was an election that still, while it was an electoral college, call it what it is, landslide, it was still a reasonably close election in a lot of these swing states. And I think big tech leaning in on a laser-focused strategy, focusing on Pennsylvania, focusing on Michigan, Wisconsin. Of course, that helped the Trump campaign. I think the Democrat, in terms of lessons learned, need to reflect on just how they treated the likes of Elon Musk. I mean, there was a frosty period of words exchange, and I don't think that's healthy for an American democracy with the amount of power that the X platform and people like Musk have.
And while that self-reflection takes place among the Democrats over there, here in Europe, of course, the big question here is how will this continent stand on its own 2 feet? To see if that's possible when it comes to security and defence, we had a chat with the Swedish defence specialist, Carl Hochaksson.
The US has, since the end of the World War, been the main security provider for Europe. And even though I do not see a kind of drastic reduced role for the US in Europe, I think that we in Europe need to take more of the burden in security defense ahead. And this is also fact to the part that the US is overstretched with engagement in Europe, in the Pacific, in the Middle East. There are also kind of cross-party consensus in the US that China is the long-term focus for the United States, and this will have important consequences for Europe. And European states need to take more of the responsibility for its own security defense.
So Carla Huhaxon there saying the European Union needs to take more responsibility. Of course, NATO says it's Trump-proofed now, Matthew. But at the same time, we've seen Donald Trump say he won't be giving a penny to Ukraine, but he wants to stop the war in 24 hours.
Well, I think we should look to President Zelensky's statement that came within moments after and it was a positive and very, I think, well measured statement. Trump has made bold commitments that he's going to bring peace to this conflict. I think anybody, regardless of their views on the president-elect of the United States, would welcome a peace process. But I think some of the rhetoric as it relates to the US's position in NATO is overblown. What did he do? Did President Trump do when he was in office as it relates to NATO? He rightly forced some of the European countries to increase some of their military spend to NATO. That's welcome. And furthermore, domestically, while the President of the United States is a powerful figure, there will be checks and balances within his own party that are rightly stand behind and are very pro-NATO. So,
you agree?
I think it's really interesting your point on checks and balances. I think one of the things that most of the watchers of this election have noticed is that for a second term, we're looking at a Trump without guardrails. It was very, very noteworthy yesterday. I had been asking myself, where's Mitch McConnell? Where is this Senate veteran who's kind of been the elder statesman of the GOP at times at loggerheads with Trump personally and politically? And yesterday, while talking about the Senate majority that had been achieved in this election, Mitch McConnell said, very interesting, I think it was probably missed in all of the flurry of discussion about this huge event. He said, the GOP will have a Senate majority which will serve as a guardrail to President Trump. That's very, very interesting. And it shows us that while everybody's talking about, the Democrats need to be in sort of self-reflection mode, I would imagine also there are people within the GOP who are wondering, where are we going? Because they lost out on a lot of the old school Republicans. Remember the Ronald Reagan Republicans who would be looking today at the scenario thinking, why wouldn't we give a penny to Ukraine? Where's my party? Where's the party gone?
And just thinking of our viewers, a lot of our viewers are worried about his stance on the Middle East because, of course, a Trump win is a big victory for Israel's hard right, Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, Natalie, you're a trade expert. I'm not sure if you're following this, if you have any comment.
I mean, I think that in terms of where we see Trump on Israel is that he's still very pro-Israel, and so I find that it to be sort of a difficult balance in the United States because people were saying, I don't support Harris because of her position on Palestine, but the fact is that Trump is also very pro-Israel. So I find it that was sort of a disconnect in my view. Like, why was that such a sticking point? I don't really see that as being logical, but, it's...
And it's worth reflecting that when Trump was president in his first terms, the Abraham Accords was a signature achievement of the Trump first term in office. And his first overseas visit was to Saudi Arabia. He had, whether it was Trump or some of his core advisors at the time, people like Jared Kushner, really weighed in and had good relations, especially with the Arab Gulf states. So I think the Trump presidency will try and use some of its personnel to lean into the GCC, the Gulf states, who are pivotal in any hypothetical peace process. You've got to bring in the Arab partners in the region. And I think a Trump administration gets that. And beyond that, looking to the future, I think a Trump administration will want to expand the very Abraham Accords that they initiated in the first place. So I think there is granted, cause for optimism as we look to the next 4 years.
Well, let's keep an eye on that. But of course, we can't close this discussion without speaking about domestic European politics as well. Look at Germany. On Wednesday night, just as Europe was reacting to the election outcome in the United States, the German coalition government collapsed. We saw Chancellor Olaf Scholz taking to the podium, expressing his mistrust for his FDP partner Christian Lindner. He fired him, and we saw then a flood of commentators taking to expressing how they felt, like the European historian Timothy Garton-Ash saying, "What a day for the German government to collapse. Just when faced with Trump, Europe needs all the strength and unity it can muster." Did anyone see this collapse of the government coming?
Absolutely not. It was sort of like, guys, not now. Seriously, read the room. It
Actually,
was greeted like a North Korean missile launch. Hey, we're over here. But I don't think it was deliberate. And I didn't see it coming at all, honestly.
Well, it's no secret there's been infighting for months and months, and we could see fresh elections in Germany as soon as early next year.
The traffic light coalition, as it was called in Germany, it was always going to be stretched at the margins. And I think there were many classical liberal voters who supported the FDP that were somewhat frustrated with the leftward leanings from the Social Democrats and the Greens. While the timing, I agree, was not ideal, I think this was inevitable. I was always sceptical that this coalition government would get all the way to the end. Got nearly there, but I think a fresh set of elections are nearly inevitable. And Scholz's own party will be under huge pressure there. There's obviously the new emerging parties in Germany. You've got the AfD, the hard right. This is going to be a tough election, and you could see a Bundestag with difficult. Well, there'll clearly be no overall majority, but they'll require difficult coalition negotiations.
Okay, and we'll also be seeing elections in Ireland taking place as well in a few weeks, called this week. So we'll have lots to talk about here on Brussels, My Love, on Euronews. But for now, thank you so much to our guests for being with us. Thank you for watching. Stay with us here, because after the break, we'll be deep diving into the implications the US elections outcome will have on the European economy. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, My Love, Euronews' weekly chat show about the week in politics. And of course, the big news out of Germany and the impact the US elections could have on Europe were the big stories we're covering this week here on Euronews. Ambassadors from all across the EU met on Wednesday morning for emergency talks to map out how to respond to a second Trump presidency. The fear, of course, is the president-elect will follow up on his campaign promises to boost tariffs. To hear how the European economy could be impacted if when Donald Trump moves into the White House, we asked Euronews' business editor, Angela Barnes.
Well, Maeve, this could be economically disastrous for the EU. That's if we're to go by what Donald Trump has said in some of his previous statements, including on tariffs. If he imposes that 10% trade tariff, that's not going to be good news for businesses in Europe, particularly those in the auto sector, for example, exposed particularly in Germany. It will certainly put pressure on GDP, which could also impact monetary policy and the European Central Bank's decision at its next interest rate meeting in December. All of this will certainly come into play, and European businesses are going to need to up their game, and European policy as well, to ensure that tsunami of regulation retains talent on European soil.
That's Angela Barnes there, Euronews' business editor, saying could be economically disastrous. I mean, if we look as well back to the campaign of Donald Trump, he said the most beautiful word in the dictionary was tariff. He's already proposed, of course, all these tariffs. I'm looking at you.
Yeah.
Could we see an all-out trade war?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, I think his favorite word, tariffs, he doesn't seem to understand the consequences of tariffs. Tariffs will definitely raise prices for the consumer in the United States, and it will also have huge implications all around the world. And I think that's what Europe is most prepared for now. And when you talk about, let's imagine that the EU puts a tariff on goods from that the US puts a tariff on goods from the EU, that hurts European exporters. But imagine that the US puts a tariff, a 60%, sometimes he's talking about, he's 200%, 2,000%, he says, on China. That also hurts the EU because those goods have to go somewhere, and there tends to be a trade diversion. And that's where the EU is in a bind where it needs to respond not only to tariffs that the US places on EU goods, but also to tariffs that it puts on Chinese goods by imposing safeguards to protect its own market from the diversion of trade. So I think it's just an extremely complicated, landscape. And what we're hearing is that the EU is ready on all fronts, to fire on all fronts. They said we were wrong-footed in 2016. We didn't expect. We thought we have this lovely, warm relationship with the transatlantic relationship, and Donald Trump blew that apart in 2016. The Europeans are prepared now, and they say when we respond, we're going to hit back hard and fast.
Because of course it's their European companies that will be caught in the crossfire. Going to hear from you in a sec. I just wanted to bring back some thoughts as well that Donald Trump said when he was in Pennsylvania last week on how he would speak to the EU. He said, the European Union, it sounds so nice, so lovely, all those nice little countries that get together, they're going to have to pay a big price.
I mean, that's classic Trump.
It's just, and we're heading for 4 more years, by the way, of those classic soundbites.
I think the thing with Trump is there's always a little bit more bark than bite. And I think that's more true than ever as it relates to US relations with Europe and the European Union specifically. I would be surprised if there was an all-out a tariff war. I certainly think, as Trump did in the campaign, he'll threaten it. But I don't think the EU should be as, well, yes, the US elections are hugely important, pivotal. They need to get their own house in order. We've just had the Draghi report here that exposed some huge holes as it relates to European competitiveness. I think Europe needs to look beyond and try and strike some more trade deals internationally.
But the problem, the American market is so vital for economies like for Germany, for Italy, for Ireland. We've seen lots of statements in Ireland this week. They're petrified. Of course, Ireland's the home to Apple, to Meta, to Google, and Trump, of course, wants all these headquarters to move back to America. He said he will decrease that corporation tax and try and attract them back.
It's interesting, you talked about tariffs, his favorite word. It would be really nice if he could switch his favorite word to consequences, because what we see is a lot of bold statements and then he doesn't unpack them, and the voters don't hold him to account to unpack these statements. So when he talks about, using tariffs, slapping tariffs, he talks about getting rid of, abolishing Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. He said 9 years to think about it. And if he were to abolish that, what would he replace it with? His answer was he had a concept of a plan. So what we see, we dig down into it, is somebody whose communication style is so incredibly, on the surface there's something, but beneath it there isn't any thinking. There's no planning.
I think it's
like, let's take off the wheels of the car. Yeah, everybody's, take off the wheels. Then what are we going to put on?
I think there's a huge gap on AI in terms of the direction. You've got a European Union with the AI Act that is jumping the gun, arguably somewhat, on regulation. You've got a new incoming US administration that is going to be very skeptical even to touch the issue. So I think that is one to watch as it relates to relationships with big tech.
And I think you also see the EU jumping in, like you said, almost jumping the gun on regulating and indeed, again, putting a regulatory burden on its companies. You're trying to be the leader. It was the leader with the GDPR, leader with the DMA. And this is the kind of red tape snarl that Draghi was talking about in his report. He said is holding back the European economy. But I also wanted to pick up on something else you were talking about, his bark, Trump's bark being worse than his bite. I think that in many ways, you see him as the sort of consummate negotiator. And so he wants to come in with, this is the bottom line for me. And I think that Europeans need to sort of see this now as this is not just a pleasant conversation. This is a real negotiation where we're bluffing and we're seeing how far we can push the needle.
And just finally, he could scrap the Inflation Reduction Act, of course, which businesses here didn't like. That could help businesses here.
Well, I think when you look at the IRA, you start to notice very, very quickly provisions that spook European industry. There are fears of deindustrialization, missing out on a lot of the economics behind furnishing all the technology that goes into the green economy. So there is that protectionism that's built into it. So will he dig deep enough to see that it actually serves American industry, or will he just scrap it? I
we'll
think
have
that
to
he
wait.
would
See, because on that point we can conclude this conversation. Thank you so much to our panel for their insights And thank you so much for watching. Stay with us here on Euronews. Hello there and welcome to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly politics chat show. I'm Maeve McMahon and alongside Matthew Robinson, Natalie McNeilis and Greg Svingen, we're just taking a look back at the news of the week. And there was plenty. But with COP29 around the corner and Spain still picking up the pieces of the aftermath of a fatal flash flood, we wanted to now hone in on what a Donald Trump presidency could mean for the planet. Because, of course, he's threatened to pull out again of the Paris Agreement. Matthew, will he?
I think there's a big chance of that, and I think sometimes the impact of it can be over-egged a bit, but that's not the case on climate. He certainly has the support of his party to do so. I think we look forward to Baku, there's going to be huge pressures on the biggest countries to step up as it relates to funds for the developing world, and you're going to see a big pushback from a incoming Trump administration on carrying out whatever outgoing commitments a Biden administration makes on that.
Well, in the past, he's called climate change a hoax. And despite what we've seen, of course, with Hurricane Helen, he also wants to promote domestic fossil fuel industries. In his victory speech, he said, we'll have more liquid gold, oil and gas than Saudi Arabia.
I mean, I think that, picking up on what you were saying, I really think that there's a sort of a leadership vacuum. And that's where the EU might be able to step in. You know, when we look at COP29 coming up, that might be a place where the EU steps up to the plate. And I think that it's not, you know, how one of the campaign slogans was, we're not going back, we're not going back. I would say that is Europe's slogan when it comes to climate change. We're not going back.
Even though the EU has lost its Franz Timmermans, who was kind of main author of the EU Green Deal.
But you see what's coming up. We have, for my beat that I cover is antitrust. And the woman who has been designated as the potential commissioner is Ribera, Spanish. She was previously the ecological transition
very experienced politician.
Minister. She's going to be in charge of antitrust policy, and you can see she's not going back on the greening of
and her work will be cut out for her, because we've seen scientists say this week that this year, 2024, will virtually certainly be the hottest year on record. If we look at the data from 2023 in Europe, we saw an increase in storms. We saw 1.6 million people impacted by floods, and losses estimated at 13.4 billion euros. So much at stake really for the climate.
We see these local events and they do have impact. The hurricane, Donald Trump has had to speak about hurricanes. So when we start to see more and more climate-generated events happening, and it's undeniable that there's a climate link, it will be interesting to see where the Trump administration is forced to stand. And it's also not forget that Elon Musk, for the character that he is, loved by some, not loved by others, he does have, a gigantic electric vehicle company, and that's going to change who drives those cars and the support that those kinds of initiatives, a green vehicle, gets from this administration.
And just on that local impact, we saw last week, Matthew, those deadly flash floods striking the east coast of Valencia, causing severe damage to a number of villages around the city, causing hundreds of deaths. Scientists say the horrific incident had the fingerprints of climate change. And actually, to hear how locals were impacted and how they're coping, we had a chat with Frances Ribas, who was brought up in the village of Aldaya, just outside that city of Valencia.
We are shocked because we feel very sad because this is a disaster. We didn't expect this because the Valencia government didn't warn us. So people received the alarm when the water was in their necks. I saw my friends, my neighbors crying because they lost everything. We need Brussels. We need the European institutions, because Valencia is Europe and Europe is Valencia. So please, this is the moment to prove that this is one Europe. So please help us.
Frances Ribas there with a very clear call for help, Matthew.
And since the last COP conference in Dubai, some reports have estimated there's been over $40 billion worldwide of natural disaster-related incidents. And I think that's going to get the attention of countries. I completely agree with your point. There's a role for the EU here to step up in the absence of maybe some American leadership. And for the Trump administration. But I think Europe needs the 1.5 degree commitment cap has already arguably been blown out of the water from Paris. There's been time and time again missed opportunities, missed targets as it relates to previous COPs. I think for this one, money is going to be key. That's such an important driver, and that's where the EU, I think, can step up and start to make some serious commitments as it relates to some of those worst off developing countries that are on the front line of the climate disaster.
Yeah, what we're also hearing is that the EU negotiators say, with all that in mind, it's difficult for us to get people on board and get people ready to make, sacrifices when we know that one of the biggest polluters in the world is not on board. And so I think that, it does complicate and make it more difficult. But like I said, the EU is not going back. They're all for.
But we're not seeing a lot of people showing up to the COP29, Greg. We've already seen Ursula von der Leyen say she won't go, Emmanuel Macron, the French president. Is it a flop before it even started?
If you don't have the big leaders going, and we're already talking about that now, and we're already asking if it's a flop, the question has a lot of the answer. It's a really scary question. I think that what you start to notice is that when these meetings happen, you have a lot of political leaders flocking to them, and even sometimes being criticized for having taken planes to them. What's behind it? Is it because they don't want the negative criticism? Is it because they don't find it's important? I don't know.
An interesting additional note, this is the third time in a row a COP conference will be hosted by a petrochemical state. You've got Azerbaijan, previously the Emirates, and before that Egypt. So I'll be curious. That has not gone without notice amongst some that are on the sidelines of the COP conference.
It's almost become a laughingstock. I mean, and in the meantime, we've seen from Francis Ribes and a lot of people in Valencia calling for help. They're victims, clearly, of climate change, as we heard from scientists saying that this does have the fingerprints of climate change. Just when it comes to immediate help, has Europe done enough to help people in Valencia, do you think?
I mean, I think that Europe is not the target as much criticism as Spain is. I think that where people, and that's what you hear from the presentation there, was the idea that the immediate problem was that Spain was not reactive enough.
And they should have warned earlier.
Yeah.
And on that point, we can bring this conversation to an end. Thank you so much, Matthew Robinson, Natalie McNeilis and Greg Sviggin for joining us this weekend. We had a lot to talk about. Thank you so much as well for watching. Any comments, you can drop us an email to brusselsmylove@euronews.com. You can also send us a direct message on social media and we will get back to you. But for now, thank you so much for watching and stay with us now on Euronews.